know you may be recorded. Okay, cool. Well, let's get started. So we're here to talk about learning differences. Something to know, I am not an ed psych. I do have quite a bit of experience with kids with different learning differences. I have a minor in special education, but a lot of what I got for this presentation came from Lisa Maharis. She is a licensed educational psychologist, and she did a presentation for us a few years ago. So I've kind of adapted the presentation she did for the K-8 department meeting to make it a little bit more tutor focused and less like just LD focused, but just some disclaimers there. So, let me move your faces. There we go. All right, a few things that we're going to get into today. So I'm going to do a general overview. We'll talk about sort of strategies that work, I think, honestly, for most kids, whether they have a diagnosis or not. Then we'll get into specific diagnoses and strategies, and then how to talk to parents. There were quite a few comments about how do we bring it up with families if we suspect something. So we'll get into that as well. Ugh, my computer's lagging. Okay, so I'm going to run through some disclaimers. We'll talk about the language that we use when we talk about some things, key terms, and then I'll go through a few myths as well. So big disclaimer, this is going to come up many times throughout this presentation, but I need to make sure everybody's aware we are not specialists. It's not our job to test, diagnose, provide any type of specialist treatment or therapy or intervention. So couple things that's going to come up when we talk to parents, but it also means that nobody's expecting you to be any type of like expert. And if anything ever feels out of scope, you should definitely bring it up with the team leader so that we make sure that the students are getting the support that they need through the appropriate channels. So we're not specialists. Everything in this presentation is going to be pretty oversimplified. I'm going to give everything at a high level view. We could spend there are people that spend decades of their lives on each diagnosis, just sort of like researching and learning and intervening. Obviously, we can't do that in an hour. So everything I go over is going to be really oversimplified. Just to give you guys a little bit of a taste, I'm going to be focused more on strategies. So if there's something that you've heard that I didn't mention, or something that you know, or a diagnosis that you have, and you feel like I've oversimplified it, I have. You're right. All right, I want to talk about language. So when we are talking about different diagnoses, there's sort of like two schools of thought. It's important to be respectful. If you're not sure what a student prefers, you can ask. I also think like it doesn't come up very often in session, but I'm going to be using the language during the meeting, so I just kind of wanted to make people aware. So the first type of language is person-first language. So we would say like a student with dyslexia. And the idea behind this is that the diagnosis doesn't define the person. So some people prefer people-first language. Other people prefer identity-first language. So this is really common in the autistic, deaf, and blind communities. So you would say an autistic student. Again, a lot of it is personal preference, so feel free to ask. The other thing, I'm going to try to say differences. I usually say learning differences. It tends to be a preferred term as opposed to disability. I think disability implies that there's maybe something wrong with the person, when really it's just every single person's brain is different, and the learning environment maybe isn't set up for a particular student's learning process. So it's not necessarily a disability, right? Like you could say that if I walked into a deaf community and I don't know ASL, I could have a quote unquote disability, right? So instead of sort of othering it, we're going to try and use the words differences, because that's really what it is. All right, a few key terms that you may hear. I'm probably not going to use a lot of them, but you could hear it if you're doing research or something like that. So the DSM is sort of the gold standard for diagnostic criteria. It has different versions. I think we're currently on the DSM-5, and it's really just what different educational psychologists use when diagnosing kids or adults even. So the word comorbidity sounds really kind of scary. It just means that there's 2 or more diagnoses. So we'll talk about it later, but a lot of people will have sort of a main diagnosis with a comorbidity of anxiety. Just, super, super common for kids, but it really just means that there's 2 or more diagnoses. It's not like terminal or anything like that. IEP and 504, these are very similar. There are some subtle differences between them. Anybody with a learning difference that they're receiving accommodations for typically has an IEP or a 504. IEP is an individualized education plan. A 504 is something provided by the district. It just sounds a little more legal. The big difference is the ages that they cover. IEPs also tend to go a little bit more in depth, but it's not something we super need to know about. A kid will have either one. So if they say like, it's in my 504 plan or it's in my IEP, they're really just talking about their diagnosis and the accommodations that have been outlined for support for that diagnosis. Okay. Some myths that I want to dispel at the beginning. So the first myth is that learning differences are common in people with low intelligence. This is actually like the opposite of the truth. By definition, a learning difference can only be diagnosed in someone with at least average intelligence. So a lot of our kids are above average intelligence, but they just learn differently. If somebody's below average intelligence, could have a different diagnosis, but it wouldn't be considered a learning difference. Hello? Oh, okay. Learning differences affect boys more than girls. This is not true, but the myth is based in sort of the reality that boys are diagnosed more frequently than girls. 66% of kids receiving accommodations are boys, but really there's no difference between how many boys versus girls versus non-binary kids have a learning difference. Girls just tend to fly under the radar more. A lot of it has to do with social conditioning and masking and things like that. Another part of it is that when the DSM was written, it was from a time when they were researching how it presented in boys and not how things presented in girls. And there are behavioral and sort of like gender differences based on our social constructs. But what that means is that girls tend to require closer observation and more proactive intervention because they might not see it as easily. Okay, so launching into some general strategies. These are just things to keep in mind or kind of test out with all of your students. I'm going to run through some accommodations specific for each diagnosis a little bit later, but they all sort of have some of these in common. So I thought I would just group them all together. You can also use these on just like all kids. It's things that I find myself trying just on most of my students anyway. So the first thing to keep in mind, anytime you get a student with a diagnosis and you're like, oh, yikes, I don't know what to do for a student with this learning difference, one-on-one support is an accommodation. It is one of the most common accommodations that you see written in the plans. So I pulled language from a few of my students' IEPs and 504s. So first one, students should work with teachers outside of class on a regular basis. So that means that this kiddo has to go find her teacher in office hours and sit down for one-on-one support. Student is required to check in with teachers for individual support. Student benefits from individual attention outside of class or during when possible. So if the teacher could walk over and help them out individually, great. If not, they should seek out support outside of class. Ensure that student has a free period that they spend in the resource center to receive additional support or small group support. These are all things documented in their plans, and it's pretty high up on the list that they need extra individual support. And the great news for us is that is our entire business model. So just by coming to tutoring, we are checking off a huge box on their accommodation list. There are some other classroom accommodations that pop up that are pretty common. I mention them just because I think it's helpful to know the types of things kids should be doing and receiving in class, but a lot of them aren't even things that we can help with because we're not in the classroom. So that's another thing to note, is that a lot of times it's not an accommodation we personally can make because we're not teaching to a whole group of kids. So preferential seating. Some kids do better sitting in the front. Other kids, if they have really high anxiety, actually do better in the back. If there are sort of noise distractions or other kids in the class that are a distraction, it could mean seating them away from those distractions. But again, it's just us in an office, so not something we super have to worry about. Small group setting, that is us. Extended time, so we might want to keep that in mind, but really that's for things like tests and quizzes, so they get extra time on those. Grading adjustments, we don't grade their stuff, but it could mean that they're able to submit late. It might mean that they don't, spelling doesn't count when teachers are grading, different things like that. They can record their lectures. So they might ask to record you. I've actually never had a kid ask, but it could come up. But it also is important to know to kind of remind kids, like, have you asked your teacher if you can record it? And then different assistive technology. So a lot of kids are able to use their computer in the classroom when it might otherwise not be allowed for other kids. I've had students that have like special pens that record and then move it over to a computer as they're writing, all kinds of different stuff. Talk to text. Okay, and then common accommodations that we'll see in session that I would honestly just try with everyone. Extended time, like I said, if they get extended time on tests, it's very likely that they will need extended time in session. So they might need extended time, so like a longer session. That could be a lot of work. So I have a lot of students that meet me twice a week or 3 times a week, because that is how we sort of tackle the extended time thing. It's going to take them a little extra longer to process. Access to notes. So in the 504 plan or the IEP, this really means that the teacher should be providing notes ahead of time, but we can meet that accommodation by giving them the paper that we took notes on when we were instructing, or letting them take a photo of the board before we erase. Calculator use. If a student has an accommodation to use a calculator, we should be using it in session. The only thing I'll mention about calculators, sometimes there's sort of stipulations, like it has to be a 4-function calculator. You just want to make sure you're practicing with the type of calculator that they'll be able to use. If you're practicing with a scientific calculator that has like all these functions, and then they don't get that on the test, it wasn't helpful. A formula sheet. So a lot of students are able to use a reference sheet or a formula sheet as they're going on tests. So you can make it literally as you go. So if it's an English student, you can keep track of the book you're reading. You can track key terms and definitions. If it's a math student, you can add to it as you learn math formulas. That way, when it comes time to study for the test, the formula sheet's ready to go. Use of a reader. This is a really big one. So if a student is allowed to have a reader, so this is literally somebody that reads to them, it's pretty common for kids with dyslexia, read to them in session, or try audiobooks. A lot of times kids can find an audiobook and read along with it, and that's helpful. But yeah, reading aloud to the student, if it's an accommodation, isn't actually doing the work for them. Okay, and then chunking out assignments. So this is something that teachers are supposed to do to help make things more accessible, but it's definitely something that we can do ourselves. And honestly, is something that I think a lot of us are doing as tutors anyway. Breaking down assignments really helps make it more approachable and helps sort of just naturally teach things like time management. Okay, so we want to be really careful to customize our tutoring to the student, not necessarily their diagnosis. So hopefully that comes as a little bit of a relief to people. You don't have to be an expert on all of the different diagnoses that could come across our roster. You're really just figuring out what works for each individual student, whether they have a diagnosis or not, and teaching to their learning style. So important to keep in mind, learning differences present differently in every person. So there's not like an end all be all, like a one size fits all fix, right? If there were, it wouldn't be as big of an issue. Our model of customizable support is helpful for everyone, right? Like that is the huge benefit. They get to come in and work with us, and we get to tweak our method to help. All you have to do is isolate each kiddo's needs and tendencies, and the knowledge that you end up having of learning differences really is helpful to anticipate how any needs or issues could arise or develop. But like, even if you know nothing, you can still have a whole bunch of things ready to go to adjust as needed, right? So it happens to me a lot where I'm explaining a concept and I'm kind of like, oh, this isn't landing. Let's start over. Let's try a totally different way. We can do that with all of our kids. So really, it's just about being able to read the room and read each kiddo and figure out what's working and what's not. And when it's not, you can adapt. And then the more you get to know a student, the easier it'll be to start with strategies that work. All right, so I'm calling them universal strategies. They're not exactly universal, but they tend to work well. Take breaks. So I build them in at regular intervals, and I never ever take them away as a consequence. So if a student is not focusing well, I'm not going to pull the break and say like, you've lost your break privileges, because that's probably a kid that needs the break more than ever. And being predictable is really helpful. So I will set timers, I'll kind of put up an agenda, but the break should come really predictably. Like I said, be predictable. So you can write a schedule or an agenda on the board. I gave you guys an agenda at the beginning of the meeting. If we're in person, I will write it on the board. And then also open and close session or task changing the same way each time, so that they know what it's going to feel like when they come into tutoring. And you can sort of like build habits that way, right? You can kind of ease them into a focused brain instead of just sort of like being all over the place and jumping in left and right. Use aids in the office and use the IEP and 504 plan. So we have all kinds of different manipulatives. You can use color. There's videos available. We have technology in all of our offices. You should read their accommodations and try and work them into session. All of that goes a long way to providing a lot of support for kids. And then stay engaged. I think like we have a tendency to just kind of talk and talk and talk and talk, and that's not helpful. If you haven't seen it already, there's a really good video that we have about wait times. I think it's going to come out in a monthly video series. Just put a little plug. It's really important to pause and give kids time to think and ask questions and process, particularly if one of the things they struggle with is processing time. The other thing you can do is ask leading questions to keep them engaged. So instead of just talking, make it more of a conversation and sort of ask questions to direct them to the answer instead of just giving it. The other thing, I didn't put it here, but I check in with my kids. If things are getting weird, I say like, do you need a break? Like if we're losing focus, if it's getting silly, if they're getting frustrated, or if you feel like things aren't landing well, be like, did that make sense? I feel like that was confusing. Should we start over? They'll be honest with you. And the more you can set up an environment where they feel comfortable telling you, like, I don't know, it just came out of your mouth, or like, I'm really sorry, I zoned out, the easier it'll be to sort of make it a more productive learning environment. Okay, so let's get into some specific diagnoses and strategies for each. Before I go into it, I just want to remind you that listening to these does not make you qualified to diagnose anybody or an expert on how to recognize it. I think this is actually more helpful if you know that a student has a particular diagnosis, kind of what to expect. And then another reminder, I am really simplifying these for us today. So starting with dyslexia, this affects reading. There's sort of 3 dys blank diagnoses that we'll go over. So the first one affects reading. It is the most common learning difference, and it's estimated that it affects about 20% of the general population, which is 1 in 5 people. That's a lot. The achievement gap really starts presenting around 1st grade and then grows throughout schooling. Something else that's important to note is that this affects all languages, it's global. So it's not necessarily like the way that we teach reading, which can sort of be a misconception. I'm going to put a visual up. This one around, gosh, like almost 10 years ago now. It is not super accurate as far as what it feels like to have dyslexia, but it can help us kind of like feel the confusion that they may feel. But just know that this isn't, there was some criticism. I still think it's good for building empathy, but there was some criticism about how it's not super, super accurate. But it can feel like letters and words are sort of like moving around or turning, flip-flopping, and it can make it quite difficult to get through a sentence. More common is that certain characters will sort of like flip. So something that can be really confusing. So B, D, P, and Q are all the same shape. They're just flip-flopped and turned around. So that can be really difficult if your brain is sort of manipulating things in a weird way. There are dyslexia-friendly fonts. Dyslexie is a really common one. You can download it. It's free. And they built the font to be bold at certain points. It's spaced in such a way that it makes it easier to read. And the letters aren't symmetrical. So it's harder for brains to kind of like smush them around. One thing that I have a student with pretty severe dyslexia, and the way she explains it is her brain, she calls them worms. Her brain finds worms on the page, so she'll track down between spaces. Can you guys see my mouse? Okay, so instead of reading this way, she'll get stuck in something where like spaces align, and she almost sees like the negative space first, and she tracks down the page between spaces. And she calls them little worms. So she drops down. So she'll skip a few lines on accident a lot, especially like I've noticed a lot when we're reading out loud, like if spaces align like here and here, she's more likely to jump down a line. Fascinating. So one of the best strategies I found for her that works is using a ruler, or even like folding the paper up or using another piece of paper. That way her brain can't see the whole page and take it all in at once. It keeps her stuck there. You can even do one on top and one on bottom so that it really isolates just each individual line. So yeah, difficulty tracking, another common symptom, below grade level in reading or writing. So we should really be choosing level appropriate enrichment materials here. We don't want to be like pulling grade level materials if they're below grade level. That's going to make it that much more frustrating. And we can work on a lot of the same skills even if we're reading below grade level. Because remember, this isn't an intelligence issue. It's just simply like the way that their brain processes words on a page. But another one, holy moly, what is my computer doing? Okay. So processing delays and comprehension issues, right? They're spending a lot of time focusing on reading the words for words and not reading for meaning. So one thing that helps a lot, especially if you have already read the material that you're going to read together, provide background information before you read. Go over main ideas, go over key vocabulary. I will even pull up something like SparkNotes or like a video summary, and we'll watch it together or read the summary together so that we know what it's about to be about, so that as they're working on the actual reading part, they've got sort of like the main idea in their heads and they can jump back in if they lose track. You may notice that these kids have really poor organization skills, so definitely using friendly fonts. I really like graph paper, even if it's not for math, because they've got individual boxes that can really help us track nicely. I create a lot of outlines. One student in particular, like, will use a table, and on the left, we'll literally just write like thesis and then write a thesis statement, body paragraph 1, and then we might put a little outline, and then we'll write the actual essay on the right. It just chunks it out and makes it feel much more approachable. And then we can literally just copy and paste everything that we built out on the side, and it's a whole essay, but then we're not staring at like a blank page. And then, of course, difficulty with spelling. So a lot of these kids will spell phonetically. It's like really aggravating to me, but spell check, for whatever reason, hasn't figured out like how to spell check for kids with dyslexia, which like, it's very obvious to me what they're trying to spell oftentimes, but it just like isn't, I think they're spell check checks for typos, not necessarily for like spelling errors. So use a computer with spell check, you can help out. Honestly, I ignore it a lot, especially if they get the accommodation in school that spelling doesn't count. Like we don't need to keep going back to the spelling if it'll hurt their confidence or if it'll slow us down or if it'll frustrate them. And you can even ignore it to the end, even if it's not an accommodation, and go through and recheck everything. But at least that way they can get all their ideas out without being really frustrated. Okay. This one, my mouth always wants to say dyscalculia, but it's not. There's an extra syllable in there. It's dyscalculia. So this affects math. It affects approximately 5 to 10% of the general population, but there's a much greater risk if a student already has something like dyslexia or ADHD, something like that. It's actually not super well understood. It's one of the newer diagnoses. So a lot of people feel like it seems a little murky and it's hard to find information about. That's true. But we do know that it affects math. So an example, somebody with dyscalculia could tell you which number's larger because they can see like which one's taller, but they may not be able to tell you which between 9 and 8 is the bigger number if they're visually the same size. That would be for like a much younger kid. Older kids kind of have different issues with it, but it's almost like a number sense difference. Okay, so some symptoms and strategies. So remember, they have difficulty remembering basic math facts and formulas. So keeping that journal as you go, because these are kids that are likely to get a reference sheet on a test, and you have them all at the ready in their words, in things that make sense. I particularly like to use colors in this to kind of differentiate different steps and help them see where did that come from, what's going where. They may be slower to perform calculations and have weaker mental arithmetic skills. So definitely mimic accommodations. If they get a calculator, don't make them do a whole bunch of mental math in your sessions. If they don't get a calculator, build in warm-ups with practice. So this would, a lot of younger kids aren't allowed to use a calculator yet, especially like before middle school. So if they do have to memorize their math facts, you can work in things. I mean, I think every K-8 tutor by this point knows I love Bean Bean Bean. If you haven't seen it and you're a high school tutor, go check it out. It's really fun. But it's a great way to practice, and you can kind of make it time bound or achievement bound, and just kind of get their brain moving through the math facts before you jump into homework where they'll have to recall. Okay, a lot of difficulty imagining a number line or sort of like being able to estimate. You know, this is, kids like this might say like 10 times 10 is 6,000 and not catch that that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we use a lot of manipulatives, helping them make things more visual, drawing pictures of word problems. There's a ton of stuff in the offices, but if you ever get a student and you feel like you need more tangible things, we can definitely order it. We've got like 3D solids that you can take apart and lay out into nets so they can actually physically fold it up and see what's happening. And then difficulty trying to understand abstract concepts. So higher level math is going to get harder. I would try and make concepts applicable to everyday life. And if you can't do that, break it into really repeatable steps and processes so that they have a system that they can follow. Interestingly enough, it kind of makes sense, but this can affect other areas of life as well. So really poor sense of time and time management. So as kids are driving, like they may be late everywhere because they haven't quite grasped the idea of like, how long is it going to take to get somewhere? This is part of the learning difference. So build in a lot of timers and alarms to help keep them on track and keep them focused. If they don't get extended time and they have to manage their time on tests, you might want to do timing drills in session to help them build some of like the time knowledge. There's a persistent need to count on fingers. I would say follow school accommodations. Honestly, I ignore it a lot of the time. if it's not something that they have to be able to do quickly in their head and it's not hindering them, which by the time they're in 8th grade, if they have quickly got a system down, I let it go. A reason for that is because they have really high math anxiety. So like be very nice and don't call them out on things like counting on their fingers if they get a calculator, if it works for them, because we're trying to focus on other things. And we don't want to make them insecure in our sessions. And then another very, very common one is messy work. So again, use graph paper. Another common thing is to take lined binder paper and turn it sideways because it makes the lines come up and down so they can sort of stack their math appropriately instead of losing track of like a long division problem or like polynomial long division. If they shift it, you're going to get the wrong answer, even if you totally understand how to do the math, right? Okay, and then dysgraphia. So this is our third one. This affects writing. It's about 5 to 15% of the general population. And again, it tends to pop up more frequently with people that have an existing diagnosis. So this is actually one of my students writing. This is a 17-year-old female's writing. So it's almost not legible. The spacing is really funky. And the size of her letters doesn't always make sense. You can see like this Y doesn't actually drop down below like we would expect a Y to. Her arrows don't necessarily connect. So like, I have seen her make the mistake where she would say, oh, like what's L7? That's an arrow, right? So it tends to be sort of like spatial awareness on paper. All right, so a lot of incorrect spelling capitalization, sort of just like funky spacing and sizing, and then like difficulty staying in line. So like this kind of goes straight and then it maybe jumps around. She actually did a pretty good job staying in line here, but if we had zoomed out, you would see it's like crooked on the whole paper. So use a computer. That's like the biggest thing here. If you can use a computer, do it. Harder to do for things like math or chemistry. But if a computer is accessible, that's a huge accommodation. Use wide ruled paper so that if their letter spacing gets funky, they still have space within the line to adjust. And then same thing, graph paper or lined paper turned sideways. They may write slowly, or it could be very, very frustrating to them to write it because it takes a lot of energy. So I think a lot of times we will push kids into using certain types of things. Like, I don't want you to use a pen during math. If they have a pen that they love and it moves easier across the paper or it feels more comfortable in their hand, whatever it is, if it just like they're emotionally attached to this pen and it makes it less of a hurdle to put it on the paper, let it go. Let them use it. A lot of times there are grippies that help a lot, or even a larger size pencil can help. The other thing I've found is like letting kids write on the whiteboard tends to go better because they can spread their thoughts out, use different colors. The pens are a little bit bigger. So I have one student who we do all of her math work on the whiteboard, and then she takes pictures and submits those for showing her work. And she doesn't actually ever have to go and copy it down onto paper. And it's just, for whatever reason, easier for her to approach it that way. And then difficulty copying words from the board. So this is something that would show up a lot in class or in session if they're trying to copy notes off the board, or their notes will be really messy and disorganized. So if they don't have to copy it down, don't make them. If they want to take a picture of your work, or like I said, I have that student who does it on the board and she submits it from the board, that's totally fine. For things like English, like use graphic organizers so that it spreads their work out for them and sort of makes it more organized. A lot of times, like if it's in a bubble, it feels okay for it to like maybe not be right up and down and it doesn't feel as messy. Just kind of help them section things off a little bit better. It can be really frustrating to get started. Like if you know it's going to be hard, there's just like an emotional barrier there. So same thing, break up writing assignments into smaller chunks, or use that graphic organizer. And this is honestly probably the biggest one with dysgraphia. They have difficulty writing, organizing, or articulating on paper, but they can do everything just fine when speaking. So this can come down to like really kind of granular details, like their grammar is horrendous when they write, but they speak with perfect English. So we can type for them. They can talk their ideas out and we can just sit and type for them. They should read their work out loud when they're editing because they're more likely to catch it when it's out loud. They can use, I haven't found one that I love, but there's like a lot of talk to text. Like Siri does me dirty all the time. So I don't even like it on my phone. But if kids have a program that they like where they can talk into it and it'll turn it into words, that's fine. I also think it can work as a good starting point, just to get things moving and to get things down. But I don't mind just like typing as my kids talk, and then we can go through and edit it together. But it really, when they can articulate out loud what they want to say, but then there's a barrier when it comes to putting it on paper, it can be just like beyond frustrating. So oh wow, the chat's popping up.
Okay. We've got some fun resources in there.
Okay, good. Yeah, I believe that you guys know a lot. The other thing I'll mention, since there's a lot of resources here, kids come in knowing what they like and what they want to use, and you can just let them do it. A lot of times they know what works for them and what doesn't, so you can totally follow their lead. Okay, ADHD, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because Christina is doing a presentation on this next week, I believe. So if you want to know more about ADHD, please attend her presentation. She is an actual expert, so she'll be a better resource for this. But it's estimated that about 9% of kids under 18 are diagnosed with ADHD. That number is probably climbing. Again, boys are twice as likely to have a diagnosis, but that doesn't mean they're twice as likely to have ADHD. It just presents really differently in girls. And one thing that I think can come up a lot in our sessions is kids may not appear to be listening. They may be staring off into space. They may be fidgeting with something. They may be looking elsewhere. It doesn't actually mean that they're not listening. So we don't have to necessarily focus on like eye contact or appearing focused, because a lot of times kids will be thinking about looking focused and thinking about how they look instead of thinking about what you're saying. And it's better to just kind of let them do what helps them listen instead of forcing them to think about looking like they're listening. All right, so just some strategies for kids with ADHD. Adapt worksheets for them. If they get distracted kind of bouncing around on the paper, you can cover up different questions, or use a different one, like fold it or use a different piece of paper to cover it up. There's a lot of sort of like common mistakes that they make, and they may not be as good at checking their work. So if you know that a kid is going to make a lot of the same mistakes over and over again because they're moving too fast or whatever it may be, make a checklist together so that when it comes time to check their work, they're checking for their personal errors. Use a timer. There is nothing quite like a timer that'll get a kid to race against the clock and get moving. Now, we don't want them to rush through it and do a bad job, but if they're just really struggling to get motivated and get started, a timer can really be a great little tool. Let them wiggle. Sometimes we want them to sit still, but it's okay. I trade chairs. I have one student with pretty severe ADHD, and anytime she comes, I swap chairs with her. So I sit in the plastic chair and she sits in the swivel chair, and she can kind of like wiggle back and forth and swivel around if she needs to, and it has been a total game changer. So don't be afraid to do that. There are fidget toys in offices. So if you don't have fidget toys and you want them, talk to your office manager or director, but let them use the fidget toys. I choose simple office spaces. So there are certain offices that I know have a lot of distractions in them, whether it's a lot of posters on the board, Or like I try not to do anything like in Menlo Park, sort of like the fishbowl ones, like the zoo, where you're at the front. It's so just I get distracted just like watching people walk by and seeing what's going on. Oh my God, that person honked at the stop sign. What happened? So try to choose office spaces that'll limit distractions. Build in rewards. You know, we have a lot of Jolly Ranchers. You can put a Jolly Rancher somewhere and let them say like, okay, if I do this, this, and this, then I get to eat the Jolly Rancher. And then check in frequently. So like ask, how are you doing? Do you need a break? Right? Those sorts of things. The other thing that's not on this slide that I have found is if they have to watch a video, put it on 1.5 speed. Their brains move quickly and they oftentimes get bored because we're moving too slow for them. So if you can throw on a video and increase the speed, it really, really helps keep them engaged and sort of like focused on the material. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about ADHD. Like I said, if you have more questions or if you want a deeper dive, Christina's going to do a lot next week. So I'm going to kind of leave it at that. I'm going to touch on a few other disorders. They're not learning differences per se, but they are diagnoses that can affect kids in school. And like I said, Lisa Maharis, who made the presentation, had been here initially, and I thought there was some useful information. So I pulled some of hers and gave us a little bit, but I don't want to spend too much time on these. But anxiety and depression can be huge. I left this statistic in here. This is where anxiety and depression, like sort of like the rate of diagnoses was before COVID. That number is so much higher for our students now. I didn't get the exact diagnosis, or statistic, but just know that it's higher and it's very, very common as a comorbidity. So anything, if a student has dysgraphia, they may also have anxiety, particularly when it comes to writing, right? So just keep in mind. It can cause difficulty concentrating and sleeping. Sleep is so critically important. So if kids aren't sleep, I mean, they need more sleep than we do as adults. And if you have an issue with sleep, it can make it just that much worse. Of course, fatigue. They may feel bored. They may, because they're having trouble focusing, they could like lose track of what's going on and then get really bored because they can't keep up. And then kids could be really sad. They could feel hopeless. They could have a lot of insecurities and feel really inadequate. So this is not, we're not therapists. So it's not our job to sort of like talk kids through these issues, but know that they have a huge, huge impact on academic performance. So stay clued in. If you feel like the kid is feeling overwhelmed or if you've lost them, try and take a breath and redirect it. We don't necessarily, like I said, we're not therapists, so we're not going to try and get into like the nitty-gritty of what's going on, but see if you can help them redirect their energy into something else or give them a break. Like going outside does wonders for your mind, body, spirit. So if you need to actually step outside and get some air or let them do it, totally fine. Have them try standing up while talking. There's a lot of sort of like mind-body connection things that we know help a lot. And if you can be active and sort of like keep your, especially like anxious energy, if you can redirect it into movement, super helpful. A really natural way to do this is to just send them up to the whiteboard. If you're like, it's weird to make kids stand up, just make them go stand at the board and then their bodies are moving sort of more naturally. Perfectionism comes up a lot with anxiety. So reframing mistakes into opportunities. I put on instrumental music a lot. There's a lot of like lo-fi stuff that's really helpful and just kind of like setting the mood in the room. It's very calming. I love having music on. I just make it instrumental and I try to keep it sort of chill. There's a lot of like study lo-fi, calming ones, things for anxiety specifically. Use a fidget device, same thing. They can sort of like redirect their nervous energy into that. And then like be very patient and calm and give kids multiple options and choices. So like, would you rather start here or here? Do you want to do this or that? And then they're a part of the process, but they're still making a choice that's productive, right? And then the last thing, one thing I teach my kids, especially like if testing anxiety comes into play, I talk about like, what are questions you can ask yourself if you start to feel stuck and panicked on a test? It's all the things that I'm going to ask you in session, but like, how can you start to ask yourself those questions to back away from the panic? Okay, executive function disorder. This is like a very common thing that parents call in about, but it's not necessarily a set diagnosis. So there is an executive function disorder that is a full diagnosis. It's really common with ADHD in particular. However, a lot of middle school and high school parents will call in and say that somebody is struggling with executive function or executive functioning. Low motivation or disorganized kids who haven't figured out how to like be a human yet doesn't necessarily mean that they like have executive functioning issues. So just keep that in mind. You'll use a lot of the same sort of like study skill strategies, but it is like a new buzzword over the last few years. And struggling with executive functioning is totally normal in this age group. It's normal among adults, especially like if we don't want to do something. It's hard to get started. Like, so low motivation does not mean that somebody has executive function disorder. Okay, so some symptoms: low self-awareness and low self-restraint. So they may not always notice that they have gone off track, or they may not be able to resist bouncing on the couch in that one particular office, right? So like, if you start to notice that there are certain things they can't resist touching, choose an appropriate office space once you start to figure that kiddo out. They may have really poor working memory and retention. So use checklists and routines so that they start to know what to expect and are more likely to recognize that something is missing. Similar, poor time management, planning, and problem-solving skills. So again, timers, alarms, reminders, just try and keep things constantly top of mind for them. They may have difficulty starting or shifting tasks. So you may have to do a lot of scaffolding up front. So really hold their hand getting started. But once they're moving, a lot of times you can back way off and let them run the process. And then it doesn't feel like you're holding their hand the whole way through. You're just finding ways to help them get started. And then these are our kids that you'll look at their grades and you'll say, oh, I did that with you. Why is there a 0 in the grade book? They might forget to turn it in. They might forget to do it all together. So I try and find ways of organizing their lives that is like maybe not as typical. Several of my students have really benefited from those like accordion folders instead of a binder because they can shove, but it's organized. So it has a place to shove it, and then it closes all the way instead of a folder where it's just kind of loose. Yeah, I've had several kids. It has worked wonders. And it's all in one, and it's not super heavy. As far as planning and using planners, use more like obvious things. So like slide something down that clear part of their binder so it's front and center. You, instead of using the school planner, use an app. There's a lot of really cool homework tracking apps, and it's like on their phone and will pop up to remind them that things are happening. Canvas has an app. It's okay. It's not great. It's okay, but you can try it. Okay, and then there's some processing disorders. So there's auditory, visual, and sensory. These tend to not be isolated. I actually have one student with an auditory processing disorder, and that's her only diagnosis. But it basically has to do with like the way your brain takes sensory information and interprets it. So if kids have an auditory processing disorder, just talking, like if I cut the slides and was just talking at you guys, that would be impossible. So we want to provide like different visual aids, things like that. They may have trouble following just verbal directions, not because they're defiant, but because it didn't like process in their brain. Visual, same thing, but using their eyes. And then sensory, I only mention this because it could be certain offices or spaces might be really like kind of overwhelming for these kids if they're sensitive to certain noises. Texture comes up a lot, like different clothes that just like really bother them and distract them. So it could be like something on the chair, a certain material, just things to keep in mind. So use multiple teaching modalities. Everything you do, try and have multiple ways of teaching it. So right now I'm talking, I've got these slides up. I've tried to put different things to kind of like mimic. If you can pull in manipulatives, that's great. Make sure you have a private room so that noise isn't an issue. Try music or a sound machine and just check in. How are you doing? Did that make sense? I feel like I just talked for so long. Did I lose you? Okay. Talking to parents. So this is, I think, probably maybe the most stressful part for us as tutors is looping in parents. So first of all, a trick for everybody moving forward, on every scheduling call, I ask if a student receives accommodations. Sometimes parents just don't mention it. And that saves me having a conversation later and trying to figure out how I'm going to bring it up. And then if they say like, oh yeah, she had dyslexia. Great. Can I see the 504? Can I have a copy of the IEP? Or they're kind of like lengthy reports. So you might ask for just the accommodation pages, but just a great little tip. Now, we may not be at that point with everybody. We may have passed the scheduling call. That's okay. But we want to communicate with all parents. So I mentioned this. I've had a lot of my kids with different diagnoses mention things that are really important to talk about at home. So just tell parents what you're seeing in session, how things are going. Follow up on kids' things say. I like recently had a student mention that like she doesn't think her meds are working. Like, does your mom know? Let's tell her. Or like, she's like, I keep forgetting to take my meds. Oh, okay, let's tell your mom that you need help at home remembering to take your meds in the morning. A lot of times my kids will also say like, my teacher wouldn't give me extended time. That's illegal. They have, like, legally, they must follow the outlined accommodations. And kids can be a black box. They say more to us a lot of times than they say to our parents. So just make sure you're passing along those pieces of information. And then help kids advocate for themselves and loop parents in. So if you're going to email a teacher together, CC the parents so that they know the email went out, and talk about things that you're hoping the kid will be able to do on their own, because this is something that they're going to have to advocate for their entire lives. Okay, again, before we talk to parents, we must all remember we are not specialists and we cannot test, diagnose, or provide intervention or therapy. So to start the conversation, check in with your team leader. They're very good at this. Schedule a call. I think tone goes a long way, and it's much easier to keep it more casual and light and sort of just a check-in over a phone call. Whereas if you put all this in writing and they have to interpret your tone over an email, you know, who knows how it's going to come across. Start with some positives, talk about how things are going, what's going really well, and then talk very concretely about what you've observed. Here's what I'm noticing. Here's where we're struggling. Here's a persistent pattern that has come up. If the kids a lot of times the kid will be like, I think I have dyslexia. I think I have ADHD. You can say, so-and-so brought up in our session that they think they may have ADHD. Have they talked to you about this? You can use kids as an in. And then I always ask, is this something you're seeing at home? Have any teachers mentioned this before? Because a lot of times we're not the first person to mention it. And that could just be all you need to open the box. They could say like, yes, we were looking into getting him tested, but we didn't know what the process was. Or yes, teachers have said that in the past, but it didn't seem to be that big of an issue, so we let it go, sort of whatever. And then listen. I said they may have suspicions of their own. They may know why it's happening, or they have strategies. Like ultimately, it doesn't really matter what the diagnosis is, because like I said, we're taking every kid as a different learner anyway. So if they have strategies that have worked in the past, we want to know what they are. If it ultimately leads to getting a student tested, use your best judgment before making suggestions. Some families are really resistant to it. And if you have mentioned it and they don't want to hear it, we've got to let it go. Like I said, our tutoring doesn't change whether or not there's a diagnosis. It does, the support that they have at school will certainly change, but ultimately we're there to support whatever's happening at school. So if you feel like you're getting a ton of pushback, you've got to drop it. Ultimately, we have to remember parents really just want their kids to be successful, and we have more information than they do. So the vast majority of these conversations go very, very well. They're very thankful that we've reached out, and they're super open to whatever it's going to take to make sure that their kids will succeed. If you're looking for a list of referrals, this is the main AJ website, so anybody can find this. You go to the resources tab, and right down here at the educational psychologist / other resources, there's a fabulous list of experts. Just so everybody knows, directors at the company do networking meetings with these people every year. So they all come vetted. They're all people that we've had positive conversations with. And there's no money exchange in any of this. So we don't get any money for referring kids to them, and they don't get any money for referring kids to us. It's truly all just good faith. We think this is someone that's really good at their job that we want to bring into our team of support for your kids' educational success. So that is perfect timing.
Perfect
It
timing.
is all about learning differences.